In the spring of 1910, Parisian opera-goers were barraged with advertisements promoting the upcoming performances of a scandalous opera based on a play by the notorious Oscar Wilde, Salome. Or was it Salome? Potential audience members could purchase tickets for the performances at the Paris Opera, or were they being sold at the Théâtre Lyrique Municipal de la Gaîté? At least Parisian opera fans knew the work they were attending would be sung in French. Or was it German? Confusion among the opera-going public in April and May 1910 was understandable. Two operas, both to librettos adapted by their composers from Wilde's play, were being performed in Paris at the same time. The first, Salome, featured music by an unknown French composer, Antoine Mariotte. The second, Salome, was the creation of the famous German master Richard Strauss. Allegedly, promoters were capitalizing on the confusion by selling tickets to an opera based on the biblical story of Salome, no further identifying information provided. Today, opera-goers attend performances of Salome without any uncertainty regarding which opera they will see. But for a brief time, two Salome operas competed in an admittedly unfair fight for recognition. In this paper, I will investigate the reception in 1910 of Antoine Mariotte's and Richard Strauss's Salome operas within the fervently nationalist atmosphere that characterized much of the French musical press in the years immediately preceding World War I. Drawing on the research of Stephen England and Michael E. Nolan, among others, I will position this reception within the context of a musical press that became increasingly polemical in its rhetoric in the pre-war years. Then, through analysis of reviews, I will explore the musical characteristics that critics like Pierre Lalo, Léon Vallas, and Gaston Corot identified as uniquely German or French in these operas. The traits of Mariotte's opera, which critics had previously condemned as monotonous and derivative following its premiere in 1908, were now championed as antidotes to the dramatic excess and violent physicality of Strauss's music drama. Utilizing the 1910 reception of Mariotte's and Strauss's Salome operas as a case study, I will examine how critics appropriated these musical works as vehicles for championing French music and attacking its German counterpart. Today, Antoine Mariotte is a little-known figure, though at the height of his career, he directed the Conservatoire d'Orléans and Paris's Opéra Comique. Though the young Mariotte had musical ambitions, in 1891 he entered the French Naval Academy and became an officer. In October 1897, however, Mariotte left his military career to attend the Schola Cantorum, a school of music recently founded by the composer Vincent d'Indy as an alternative to the state-sponsored Conservatoire. Mariotte's first large-scale composition was the opera Salome, based on the play by Wilde. The young French composer adapted the libretto from the play himself. Mariotte made substantial cuts to the play overall, the most notable example being the removal of almost all references in the play to Judaism, perhaps an effort by Mariotte to preemptively distance his opera from the still simmering repercussions of the Dreyfus affair. These cuts reflect one of many differences between Mariotte's and Strauss's opera. As I'm sure you will recall, Strauss kept these references and, controversially, gave some of the most dissonant and shrill music in his Salome to the Jewish characters. Musically, Mariotte's opera is a hybrid of conservative and progressive musical styles, reflecting both his training at the Schola and his admiration for Debussy's Pelléas et Mélisande. As such, the score features counterpoint alongside leitmotifs and is additionally characterized by a thick symphonic texture, use of the whole tone scale, and speech-like declamation. When premiered in 1908, Salome received a mixed reaction from music critics who found that the major, quote, defect, end quote, in the score, as both Léon Vallas of the Revue Musicale de Lyon and Pierre Lalo of Latin termed it, was its monotony of timbre, texture, and tonality. Quotes from these two writers are representative of the critical reaction to Salome in 1908. An emphasized and desired monotony, The majority of the score is perhaps in F minor. The respites are rare, the dark hue is persistent. The orchestration underlines the monotony of the ensemble. It is characterized by a great heaviness of bass instruments. Cor anglais, bass clarinet, bassoons all too often crush the entire ensemble, and with a perpetual overloading, reinforced again by the predominance of low voices, contralti, baritones, and basses. And that's Valas, which I did not introduce. Lalo concurred, writing, "The sonority of Monsieur Mariotte's work has some monotony caused together by the too constant fullness of the orchestra and by the too frequent use of the same tonalities. The key of F minor, in particular, reappears at all times, and one could nearly call this Salome a drame lyrique in F minor." We will see later how the generally accepted monotony of Mariotte's score was, in 1910, transformed into an antidote to the vulgarity of Strauss's music. But first, let us return to the years before the premiere of Mariotte's opera. On December 9th, 1905, Strauss's Salome premiered in Dresden, an event that brought Mariotte to a dreadful realization. Though he had been composing his Salome since 1902, he had never secured the rights to Wilde's play. In the spring of 1906, Mariotte learned to his dismay that Adolf Fürstner, Strauss's publisher in Berlin, had purchased exclusive rights to the text. Not sure how to proceed, Mariotte continued to compose and completed his Salome in the fall of 1906. The following spring, Strauss's Salome opened in Paris at the Théâtre du Châtelet. In response to this, Mariotte wrote to Strauss directly and asked for the German composer's permission for Mariotte's own work on Wilde's text to be performed at some date in the future. Strauss graciously replied to Mariotte's letter with a full authorization. Mariotte eagerly arranged for the premiere of his Salome at the Opéra National de Lyon during the upcoming winter season, that of 1907. In response to the announcement of the premiere, and unbeknownst to Mariotte, a Parisian journalist, Émile Berne, published on the front page of Le Figaro on September 11, 1907, an account of the long road taken to the stage by La Salome Française. With this article, Berne set a series of events in motion that would become Le Cas Strauss-Mariotte, or the Strauss-Mariotte case. In highly effusive language, Berne reported a romanticized version of the opera's origins, in which he depicted the swashbuckling Mariotte as composing his Salome while sailing the high seas. Phrases of the score began to be written during the hours of duty to sing in his head, and that's how the first idea of the work that became illustrated by Richard Strauss was born one fine day 12 years ago on the China Seas in the back of the mind of a naval officer on a French vessel. Strauss's reaction to Berne's admittedly inaccurate article was swift. 5 days later, the publisher Fürstner, acting as Strauss's proxy, issued an interdiction on the projected Lyon premiere of Mariotte's Salome. After more strenuous appeals by Mariotte, Fürstner relented and gave Mariotte permission to have Salome premiered at Lyon in a production now scheduled for the fall of 1908. Fürstner's demands, however, were exorbitant. 40% of Mariotte's earnings from the Lyon production were to be paid to Strauss, and 10% more to Fürstner. Unbelievably, the publisher further stipulated that following the Lyon performances, Mariotte should send all copies of his score, as well as the vocal and orchestral parts, to Berlin to be destroyed. Mariotte resigned himself to these conditions and conducted the premiere of his Salome at the Opéra de Lyon on October 30th, 1908. The Strauss-Mariotte case did not end there, however. In the month following the premiere, the influential music critic Pierre Lalo published an anti-Strauss polemic in Le Temps, the most influential and important news source in Third Republic France. I do not think that ever in any country at any time has similar duress oppressed an artist and a work of art. The marvel is the surrender and destruction of the work. Our mind boggles in reading these fantastic clauses, reminiscent of what we know of the formalities of confession such as they celebrated in the Middle Ages. What will be the ceremony for the destruction of the scores? Will they burn them with great fanfare before the people of Berlin and auto da fe on the Unter den Linden? Will Monsieur Mariot be required to attend in his shirt with bare feet and a noose around his neck? Or, in accordance with the subject of the drama, will he offer his head on a silver charger, the silver of the copyright money, to Monsieur Fürstner, while Monsieur Strauss, undulating to the rhythm of the music, dances the dance of the seven veils? And I desperately wish there had been a satirical cartoon that accompanied this particular article. Lalot's article unleashed a fury of pro-Mariot support in other French journals, with most responses having nationalist or at least patriotic overtones. Strauss's role in what came to be known as the Salome affair was rehashed in articles in both the general and specialized musical press in the fall of 1908 and throughout 1909, including columns in Le Figaro, Commedia, Mercure de France, Le Courrier Musical, La Dépêche de Lyon, Le Feu, Musica, Revue Musicale de Lyon, and Le Gaulois, an example of which is shown on the slide. Finally, in the spring of 1909, the musicologist, homme de lettres, and eventual Nobel laureate Romain Rolland sought to end the Strauss-Mariot controversy. A longtime friend of Strauss, Rolland appealed to the German composer privately, as well as in a series of articles published throughout the summer of 1909 in the Bulletin Français de la SEM. Rolland implored his colleagues in the press to dismiss with the purposefully inflammatory language and nationalist rhetoric. Permit me to fraternally implore my colleagues, Latin as well as German, to take care at this time with the nationalist spirit which is trying to slip again without our knowledge into our artistic discussions and threatens to poison them. And he was referring back to the 1891 Lohengrin dispute or riots in Paris when he said that. In response to Roland's efforts, Strauss, through Fürstner, finally granted Mariot the right to have his Salome performed without restraints. The editor of the Revue Musicale de Lyon concluded that this was the end of l'affaire Salome, and that appeared to be true. Mariot's Salome went on to be performed in Marseille, Nancy, Le Havre, Geneva, and Prague over the next few years. The origin of the stridently nationalist rhetoric used by music critics in their articles on the Strauss-Mariot case lay in Germany's 1871 defeat of France in the Franco-Prussian War. In response to this humiliation, some journalists and politicians constructed a French national identity in opposition to a mythologized hereditary enemy, the German, who acted as an inverted mirror, to borrow Michael E. Nolan's term, by projecting undesirable traits the French saw in themselves onto a cartoonishly evil other. This rhetoric was intensified during the Dreyfus affair, when, as Stephen England has written, a generalized Judeophobia among some French nationalists on the far right was hardened into a politicized anti-Semitism in which the enemy without, the German, was conflated with the supposed enemy within, the Jew. Though the right, along with its extremist fringe, only briefly held power in the early years of the Third Republic, their rhetoric spread much farther than their political influence. As Nolan states, quote, "While the nationalists represented numerically one of the smallest portions of the political spectrum, their mythologies of the adversary exerted perhaps greatest influence," end quote. Between 1898 and 1914, occasional flare-ups in relations between Germany and France, such as the Moroccan crises of 1905 and 1911, became opportunities for journalists, including music critics across the political spectrum, to adopt a sensationalized nationalist and anti-Semitic rhetoric, in part to entice the newly literate masses to become regular readers of their newspapers. England has characterized this anti-Semitism as, quote, "largely an affaire de plume et de scandale" in its pre-war manifestation, end quote. And before continuing, I wish to emphasize that the rhetoric employed by these journalists did not reflect the views of most in the left-leaning Republican government or the French population at large. It is into this hostile and volatile milieu that Mariot and his Salome were plunged by the Strauss-Mariot case. Mariot's conflicts with Strauss dramatically intensified the nationalist rhetoric used in press criticism. the copyright dispute between an unknown composer from Lyon and the powerful German master became a cause célèbre for critics who united against what they viewed as most detrimental to French musical culture, the so-called cosmopolitan influence of the new generation of German composers exemplified by Richard Strauss. This was made painfully obvious to Mariotte when, on April 21st, 1910, his Salome was performed in Paris at the Théâtre Municipal de la Gaîté, only days before Strauss's Salome would open at France's National Opera House, the Paris Opera. As Robert Broussel of Le Figaro wrote of Mariotte's Salome, quote, "It was no longer a work, but a cause, and at least in the eyes of the public, it was absolutely necessary that Mariotte's Salome was better or worse than the other." As the two Salome operas were performed concurrently in Paris, French critics took the opportunity to attack German music by appropriating Mariotte and his opera. The musical elements of Mariotte's Salome that critics previously described negatively as monotonous were now portrayed as essentially French and championed as antidotes to Strauss's barbaric, i.e. German, excess. These perceived French qualities of Mariotte's composition were enumerated by critics. The French Salome demonstrated sobriety, conviction, charm, nobility, dignity, and simplicity. It was also honest, conscientious, serious, true, modest, distinguished, sincere, and without easy effects. These qualities, stated Lalo unequivocally, were the, quote, difference between the German genius and the French genius, end quote. Characterizing the two operas as polar opposites engendered descriptions of Strauss's Salome as physical in nature and Mariotte's as more cerebral. Many critics use metaphors of conquest and violation to describe the effect of hearing Strauss's music drama. This language may have reflected what the travel writer Georges Ducroc referred to in 1910 as the, quote, poorly healed wound, end quote, caused by the German acquisition of Alsace-Lorraine nearly 40 years prior. Broussel of Le Figaro informed his readers of his experience hearing Strauss's Salome, writing, "It was difficult to judge the work other than physically." Lalo concurred in Lettant, writing, "Mariotte's new Salome does not unleash on you the frenzy which possesses the German Salome, the fever, the deliriousness, the fury which acts on the listener like rapid and violent shocks and leaves him overwhelmed, annihilated, and vanquished." Albert Desrolles of Les Annales Politiques et Littéraires commented, "Assuredly, there is not in Mariotte's Salome this violent frenzy, this excited nervousness of the music of Richard Strauss, which acts in some way physically on the listener." And Adolphe Adoret of La Petite Parisienne described how the ardent, frenetic, unleashed music of Monsieur Richard Strauss entered us like a brutal invasion. In accordance with these observations, critics noted that Mariotte's opera affected the listener in a more profound way than Strauss's did, by stimulating the mind. This was, as critics saw it, a much more French way of composing. Gaston Corot of La Revue Musicale SEM opined, "Monsieur Strauss twists our brain and senses, penetrates us from who knows what mixture of delectable horror and revolting sensuality. Monsieur Mariotte encourages us to the most serious thoughts." The physicality of Strauss's music in the mind of Lalo resulted from what was considered a cardinal sin, bad taste. The musical idea of Mariotte has nothing vulgar or tasteless. It is warm, energetic, and expressive. You will not find bad taste in his music, the terrible bad taste that is that of Monsieur Strauss, this barbaric taste at once very close to savagery, huge and unbalanced, puerile and formidable, which will not stop before trivialities or the worst ugliness, which searches excessively for material effect, which focuses only to magnify this effect by an unrestrained accumulation of sonorous means, and to oppress the listener through the violence of physical shock. Accusing Strauss of searching only for material effect became commonplace in the press's criticism. Materialism, opportunism, exteriority, all were code words for composers supposedly motivated only by financial reward, and who therefore represented what the founder of the Schola Cantorum, Vincent Dandy, alleged to be the, quote, Italo-Jewish, end quote, school of Rossini and Meyerbeer. As nonsensical as it now seems to describe Strauss's music as Italian or Jewish, some French critics saw in the German composer a master of cheap timbral tricks and harmonic novelties created to have mass appeal. It was not necessary to make much sense when engaging in this type of nationalist criticism, as when Lalo described Strauss's melodic writing. The insignificance or the vulgarity of most of the themes. Sometimes this results from the combinations of notes so elementary that they are devoid of all sense and all accent. Sometimes from the Italian melodies, Italian because of their softness, their rounded curve, the banal character of their expansion. For Corot, Strauss's score had in it an intensity of extraordinary life, but only exterior life, of the artificial, the eccentric, and the toxic. With all this excess of development and sonority, color and expression, with his extreme complication, his difficulty, and his cruelty, it is, as they say, very representative of the current tendencies of German art, whereas Monsieur Mariotte offers a good example of the qualities of conscientiousness, measure, and dignity, in form as in thought, which characterizes the profound life of our French school. The magnanimity that critics demonstrated toward Mariotte's score extended through it to Wilde's play, almost unanimously described in reviews as reprehensible. Though many did not offer specifics, the press criticism reveals that reviewers claimed to hear in Mariotte's music an evocation of Wilde's text, but found Strauss's music incompatible with the play. Lalo stated, for example, that Mariotte had revealed an essence that lay underneath the drama's surface, while Strauss had only responded to the play's surface elements. There is, in Wilde's play, a profound sadness which is the same principle which inspired it, and which has its grandeur and its nobility. This Monsieur Strauss never expressed. The music of Mariotte, to the contrary, has sought to penetrate to the essence of the emotion, to capture the substance of the drama, to concentrate it, to recreate it in thought and sensitivity. And what is sad and noble in the poem of Salome, it has sensed and seized it. It has ennobled it by the expression it has given. I was a princess and you disdained me. I was a virgin and you deflowered me, said Salome. The Salome of Monsieur Strauss is not a virgin or a princess, never. That of Monsieur Mariotte is. The claim made by Lalo that Mariotte's music had somehow ennobled Wilde's play was reiterated by several critics concerned with its perceived decadent and therefore unhealthy qualities. Georges Pioche of Musica congratulated Mariotte on making, quote, this nobility rise from the childishly outrageous literature, end quote, and others noted that the music, quote, purified Wilde's drama, end quote. In October 1912, Bruxelles of Le Figaro reviewed a concert performance of excerpts from Mariotte's Salome by the orchestra of the Concert Lamoureux. Bruxelles reminded his readers of the Strauss-Mariotte case, now over 3 years after its ostensible resolution, and concluded, quote, those quarrels are forgotten today. We still play the German Salome. We no longer play the French, end quote. Indeed, for all the fervor it generated in the press, interest in Mariotte's Salome was quickly lost, perhaps an inevitable fate for a work known as the, quote, other Salome, end quote. Yet, briefly, Mariotte's opera garnered national attention in 1910 as French critics positioned it as a foil to Strauss's work on the same text. Incited by the Strauss-Mariotte copyright dispute and goaded by increasingly nationalist polemics, French critics commandeered the young composer's work as the vessel from which to attack their enemy, German music. Critical reception of Mariotte's and Strauss's Salome operas in 1910, therefore, exemplifies a larger phenomenon, the increasing presence of nationalist rhetoric in the press in the decade preceding World War I. Certainly, the many musical Salomes of the period offer a powerful lens through which to examine the interaction of this nationalist rhetoric and the musical culture in pre-war years. Thank you.